Welcome to Actualize, a podcast focused on the intersection of performance, ambition, and mental health. I'm your host, Rob Pintwala. My goal for the show is to not only celebrate success, but also shed light on the challenges and sacrifices that come with ambition. Actualize is brought to you by First Session. Launched in 2019, I started First Session to help you find the right therapist. First Session is purposely designed more like a dating website than a clinical website, as we're completely focused on helping you find the right fit the first time. My team and I interview and vet our partner therapists, so you can simply browse videos, see who you vibe with, and instantly book a session. Check us out at firstsession.com and see why more than 7,000 Canadians have chosen First Session to find a therapist. Ania is the founder of Rooted, an anxiety and panic attack app that has been downloaded more than 3 million times. Ania started Rooted after she experienced her first panic attack while in university and not finding sufficient support. Everything Ania has learned about how to overcome anxiety and panic attacks has been packaged up into this award-winning app. You can find Rooted, spelled ROOTD, in all app stores. During our conversation, we talk about Ania's upbringing in Canada, Poland, and South Korea. We chat about her work ethic and how that contributed to her experience with anxiety and panic. We also discuss the concept of growth and transformation being multidimensional. We touch on being a solo founder and what it's like running a business from scratch. I hope you enjoy this episode with Ania Wysocka. Ania, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me.
I came across yourself and your app probably in the last year as we're kind of crossing paths here on the west coast of Canada. And before I learned about it, I had some friends particularly share their experiences with panic attacks with me, as they know I'm the therapy guy in the friend group. And yeah, I can't say I don't think I've ever had an acute attack. I've definitely had some panic, but I just found it so fascinating to hear like the first time it happened for them and when it came up. I think one of them was driving on the highway. Another one was actually meditating and was like already kind of on this kind of journey of mindfulness, and like it happened later, which I found kind of very surprising. And another one I think was definitely around just the work stress and like literally just burnout and distaste for work. So that's just three examples, but you must know like dozens and dozens of examples of when it might come up, right? I mean, when was your first experience with a panic attack?
Yeah, so mine was in my last year of university. And all throughout university, I had had a job. I had been studying, taking multiple courses. And this was actually the first time that I had a break. And so rather than go into it and be able to relax, I actually had a panic attack like near day one. And it just messed with the rest of my not only year, but like following years after that. And so the theory there is that I had been so busy and constantly just distracted because I was working hard, trying to get good grades and, afford living in Canada. And I guess I'd pushed back and not dealt with stuff that I could have earlier. But mind you, I was also a teenager. So it's like, I didn't grow up learning about emotions and how to deal with them. So it was all new to me. And yeah, so the theory is that as soon as I had that moment of silence, then it all came up. So maybe kind of similar to your friend with the meditation, although sounds like they were much more self-aware than I was. I was definitely not meditating at that age. I was, yeah, just trying to like keep going. So that's how it popped up for me. And yes, I've now working on Rooted heard like thousands of different of stories of how it popped up for others.
Yeah, that must be incredible. And that was so in your final year in university?
Yeah.
I can resonate with the busyness part in particular. I think, in particular, like in my high school years, actually, because I was just like constantly doing something, work or sports or like whatever, socializing, and like never had a break. And then actually, I think I had the sort of fortunate and privileged to be receiving some help to go to university. So I was working in the summer, and then I got to school and I wasn't working. And then all of a sudden, 15 hours of class per week at a 40-hour week. and I didn't make the sports team that I tried out for, and then I think my reaction to it was more depression rather than anxiety and panic. Like, I kind of shut down, which was my most pronounced, mental health kind of period of my life for 2 years, and I was stuck there for a while. But I know that, like, everyone's different, and I think that it could have easily just been a little bit more of anxiety driven for me. What was like, did you have a busy sort of, pre-university years? What did that, period of time look like for you? And that, even all through university, so you're working, so you're just kinda nonstop on the go?
Yeah, I had a event that caused, like, post-traumatic stress disorder happen in high school, and that's what I didn't really deal with or address in university. And so I think that this was, like, a delayed reaction to that.
Wow. And you didn't necessarily realize it was traumatic and sort of manifested in PTSD until later.
I knew it was traumatic, and I saw a few counselors, just like whatever the university provides, but you see them for a few sessions and then you're on your own kind of thing. And
Yeah.
that's just, as you know, like with the structure of bringing support to students or low income, it's like very, unfortunately, you don't get to create a connection with that therapist for a long time, right? You only get so many sessions. And so I personally don't think that was very effective now looking back as an adult, right? And at the time, I was like a teenager dealing with this stuff. So yeah, not only did I not have that prolonged support, I also just like didn't even know how to talk about it. And
Yeah.
yeah, it was all new. So
Wow. And it's the language that you're using before is like sort of the theory is, maybe like kind of the explanation for sort of
yeah,
why that might have come up for you, like the panic attack. It's so interesting. That sounds like the busyness almost could have been sort of like the coping mechanism, right? And or it could have been in the place like that. That's kind of what you're saying.
Just a quick introduction to chat about my company, First Session. Have you had a less than ideal experience looking for a therapist? There are lots of options out there, but it's hard to know where to get started and who to trust. My company, First Session, focuses entirely on creating the best experience finding a therapist. We vet and verify each therapist we work with, interview them on camera, and allow you to browse on your own time to see who you vibe with. You can see updated availability and book directly with them. No phone calls, no email back and forths. Run through videos and find the right therapist for you the first time at firstsession.com.
definitely. Yeah. I mean, it gave me a sense of control in a time where I didn't feel a ton of control. And the things I could control were like school and work. And yeah, that's quite consistent for me. And the reason why I say theory is because this is like after talking to counselors now, after being able to look back, hindsight is 2020. You get to analyze things that happen to you and make theories as to why they happen. And that's just something multiple counselors have supported that theory of, there was finally some quiet after all these years of busy until all of that stuff came up that I had dealt with.
Yeah. I don't need to dive too much into your past, but I'd love to just give listeners a little bit more context of, yeah, where you came from and like kind of maybe where this kind of like, neat like work ethic kind of came from. Like, did you go to high school in Canada? Did you just come for university or?
I just came for university, but I was born here. But then I moved to Poland when I was little, and that's where my grandparents were. So I was sent to go live with them for a little bit. Not sent like in a bad way, it's just like for practical reasons at the time. And then I did middle school there in Poland, and I did high school in South Korea. And then I came to BC from South Korea, and I'd never been here before. So I just showed up with two suitcases
Wow. By
at 17. That in itself is probably, quite traumatic, and that's definitely not something I'd acknowledged at the time. I just had to get busy with school
yeah.
and adapt to culture.
And by yourself, you showed up. Yeah. And what just for a little bit more context, like how would you describe the sort of culture in Poland and South Korea and in Canada? Like, I mean, I'm this could be a huge bias, but I have, some awareness that South Korea is like a hardworking culture, like very hardworking. And Poland definitely as well. Like, would you say any differently, or how would like do you think that kind of shaped your upbringing?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd say in Poland, the education system is quite a few years I think, ahead. So when I first got there, I was like in shock. In sixth grade, just like, wow, these guys are doing like algebra and geometry stuff that I wasn't going to do until like eighth grade in my or ninth grade in my American school that I went to in Korea. But I went to like a Polish school. And yeah, that was incredibly challenging at first. It was like a shock to the system and I had to like catch up. And so I'd like stay up late as a kid, like studying. And I remember my grandpa used to say, like, if you don't turn off the lights and go to bed, I won't wake you up for school. Like that was the one threat that worked for me. Cause I was like, I can't get more behind. So I think that was distilled into me. I think my mom, just observing her from an early age, she's always had multiple jobs as well. She, graduated from one of the top schools in Poland, but then went to Canada where it wasn't recognized, her degree. And so she had to have a lot of like kind of odd jobs and from coffee shops to retail. And she like stacked them on. And so as a kid, I thought maybe she didn't want to spend time with me or whatever. But then as I grew up, I was like, oh, now she's like working the whole time. And so that I think probably contributed to work ethic, just seeing her do that. Living with my grandparents, they had really high standards for, I mean, I was in middle school, so it's not like they were like pushing me like wild, but they definitely had high standards for just me in general and how I was to behave and kind of learn and go to school and everything. And then in Korea, you're right as well. Like I went to an American school, so I wasn't in that Korean system. Maybe thankfully in a way because I didn't have all of that extra pressure on top of like what I obviously already put on myself. But I was surrounded by that culture and it's very common to see kids leave school very late because after school they go to another school. Yeah, I even taught English at schools where, you know, s- kids that were teaching were like 9 to 11 and they were there at like 7 to 9 p.m. at night. So yeah, a lot of hard work, I'd say. A lot of like the idea that you can get so much done in a day. So like, why not do it?
Wow.
I think that type of mentality
Yeah.
I grew up with.
Wow. That's impressive. And And so I've heard a little bit about your story of like how you started Rooted, and it sounds like, sort of just out of filling your own filling your own need, right? And I'd love to just hear your perspective on that around, yeah, how you just like started. I mean, it sounds like so resourceful in terms of getting, the right kind of structure in place to like support yourself and maybe as part of that story, like how long, because I've also heard you say on another podcast actually that sort of I don't know if things have changed or anything that like sort of your anxiety is in sort of a better place now, right? So I was just curious, like how long you were kind of battling those types of panic attacks and that heightened anxiety, and like was that like were you kind of like building at the same time, or how did that look?
Yeah. So I'll just say on the other thing though, like as great as it was having that modeled, that work ethic modeled, I don't know like what the answer is for that because it obviously led to burnout. And I wish there was an external event that I mentioned as well that contributed to it. But like I think that there's so much good and also just letting kids have fun and not stress, right? So I don't actually know what was it. This is just my story. This is what I experienced, but who knows like what the answer is and like how to find that balance out there. So I'll
No,
just
I
put that
like
out
that.
there. Yeah. In terms of rooted though, yeah, so when I first had that panic attack, I just had no idea what was going on. I had heard of panic attacks, thought it was just people too stressed out, didn't realize like how debilitating they could be. And so I took to my phone to see if there was something there that could help, and there wasn't. There was just like a medical app and a hypnosis app, and neither of those really vibed with me. And after talking to my doctor, I was super disappointed because he gave like no information and it was a struggle. I was really feeling like nobody was giving me answers. And I guess going back to that sense of control that I love to have, like I just felt like I didn't have it. And so I found a lot of comfort in reading books on anxiety and panic attacks. And the one that really resonated the most was like a cognitive behavioral point of view. So that's largely by like Dr. Claire Weeks back in the day. She's one of the first doctors to be like, hey, this is treatable and it's not something that's permanent. It's like a behavioral condition. And that gave me so much hope at the time. Like day and night when I read those words, I was like probably crying or something. I don't know. I don't remember. But remember that it was like a transformation for my life because I went from like just feeling desperate, like things will never be okay again, to then having hope. And unfortunately, it took me many years though. So I was not, an example of someone who like got over it because by the time I even found that stuff that was starting to help, it had already been a couple years. So yeah, it took a really long time. And it wasn't until I was finally integrating some of those practices. And then some didn't work for me, some did. So Rooted is a culmination of like what worked for me personally. It is like quite a personal app in that sense.
Mm,
It's definitely expanded over the years, but when it first started, it was like extremely personal. It was written exactly how it made sense to me. And I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, so I had it all reviewed by clinicians before I published it, but it's still very, yeah, just a very personal app in that way.
it's incredible. When you launched the app, was it like, is it something that you'd actually, like, be able to test? Because I know it has, like, a feature that actually you call it the is it still called the SOS feature?
It's called like the rooter because the
Router?
idea is like rooted is about getting grounded in the ground like a tree,
Yeah,
right? So then when there's a storm, you don't topple over. And the rooter, yeah, would just like every tool is a play on words. And so the rooter is just like what roots you in that moment.
that is intended on the user, engaging with during a panic attack.
Yeah.
And were you able to build that feature, like, and test it with your own panic attacks?
It was more so like having a notebook where I had all those prompts written down. So, for listeners, the Rooter, it shows you different prompts to sort of guide you through a panic attack and debate the parasympathetic nervous system, get you out of that heightened state again. And it shows a number of different prompts that you can forget when you're in that heightened state, right? Like really rational thoughts that, you've survived every panic attack to date.
Mm,
And these do end. This isn't going to last forever. Things like that are extremely comforting to hear when you're in those moments. So I would have them written down in my notebook and physically carry around my notebook, challenge myself. I mean, my panic attacks were so bad that I struggled to leave the house. And so I, upon leaving the house, would need to like read these things. Trying to get on a bus, I would need to read them. Like I couldn't travel. I couldn't public speak. I didn't do anything that I used to love to do during this period of my life. So I did it in notebook form.
that's so cool.
And then also all the wireframes for Rooted were also drawn in those notebooks. I still have them somewhere. I should pull them out. So that people were asking for like photos of that. I should probably find it and do that.
That is so cool. Yeah, I mean, I've interviewed a lot of therapists now, and, I was thinking about when you were speaking there, one therapist just, like, was speaking about anxiety in general and how it sort of just, like, builds upon itself and, like, kind of, you know, I guess, like, accumulates and compounds, and it sounds like yeah, it sounds like if you're in this kind of trap of, like, panic and anxiety that it can easily just turn into this, like, wheel that just probably just feels like it just
Yeah.
keeps on spinning, right? And, like, you're just it's like you're stuck in it, which must be so difficult. So that's amazing that you created that. I'm also curious to kind of, like, step out of this a little bit or come to another perspective. Know there's kind of like that kind of CBT, like, tools, sounds like a lot of, like, the thought that you put into Rooted, and I understand there's, like, a lot of, like, education in there too to, like, and awareness for folks. So you kinda have this, like, people use the word, like, cope or treat, it's kind of like step-by-step process, which, sounds like is quite necessary to kind of especially if you're, like, experiencing those acute events to, like, kind of settle your nervous system down. But then I'm curious where also, like, for you, maybe personally, where, besides kind of, like, knowing the steps and knowing the tools, if there was any kind of, like, you know, lifestyle changes, kind of even if it's, like, diet or exercise or, mindfulness or movement or community, and then if there's been any, like, kind of I don't know, like deeper work, I guess you could say. I mean, even just the way you were speaking about your story, kind of in like, so that kind of like maybe deeper work, or maybe there's a different word for it, plus kind of like lifestyle, plus kind of like having all the tools. Like, how do you view, and maybe I'm missing some parts, like, how do you view all of that as kind of as the path to, overcoming some of these more acute like, challenges in getting to, like, another level of, I guess, wellness maybe is a word. Like, how do you see the combination of those
Yeah.
things? Yeah.
Totally. So really a combination of pretty much all the above, except maybe community, because at the time, like it is really hard to reintegrate with friendship. You also lose a lot of friendships when you go through a big change like that. I don't know if you experienced that during your depression, but often when you go through these periods, you leave behind friendships that were associated with whatever kind of contributed to making you sick. And that can lead to a lot of loneliness. And I say sick loosely, like, lead to this change where you need to, yeah, when lead to this place where you want to make this change. And yeah, I'd say all the above. We talk a lot about diet and exercise. Movement was pretty key for me. I've done the same workout routine for like 8 years now, zero variation, but I still love it and just worked for me. And I started doing it when I was experiencing the panic attacks. Probably, for running, I've always ran on and off. Like I used to be in cross country. So my distances have gotten much longer. But in terms of like schedule, same schedule for 8 years.
And that's primarily running? Sorry, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the routine.
Well, it's just that on Monday, I do like hit workout for legs. On Tuesday, I do a run. On Wednesday, I do hit workout for arms. On Thursday, I do a run. Friday, full body, or just that's my rest day, depending on how much I want to hike and run on the weekend. And that is just what I've been doing. And now it's 2023. So it would actually be closer, like more like 9 years that I've just been doing the same thing.
I love that.
But yeah, so that's a huge part as well. I think in general, self care. So a few of those things you mentioned, I think we can group those into the category of self care. When you are anxious, experiencing panic disorder, depressed, or experiencing other similar things, you stop caring about yourself as much. Your whole world sort of revolves around this issue you're experiencing. And so there's a lot that you miss out on in like the UN calls these like activities of daily living, or it's the World Health Organization that calls that activities of daily living. So that's as simple as making yourself a meal, showering, cleaning up the space around you, grooming, getting a haircut, etc. Like these are things that we tend to stop doing when we're in these difficult places, and they actually contribute to our self-esteem in many ways. The care that we put in the space around us, that does reflect on us. And so little things like that were all about, yeah, building back that self-esteem. So that those are the external things that you could do. So we mentioned diet, movement, caring about your space and yourself. And then obviously there's so much internal work. So like you said, the deep work that, in Rooted, there's a few chapters on like changing the way you talk about yourself to yourself. So self-labeling, rather than saying I'm an anxious person, which is like this all or nothing thinking, I say, hey, I'm a sensitive person. That's like, pretty artistic. And I'm going through a really rough time right now. And it's just such a different way of speaking about yourself, right? It's just showing yourself much more respect. And so all of those, all the above were part of my journey and are talked about and rooted. Also some like values work, like figuring out like who I really am as a person too. I struggled with all this stuff when I was pretty young. So I didn't really get to have a chill. Like my 20s were pretty awful, to be honest. So I didn't have that like self discovery exploration time that maybe my peers would have had in a different way.
Mhm.
So I sat down, sort of wrote it out, like, what are my values? Who's super important to me? What do I want out of life? And that's something that can change every year. So it's almost encouraged to keep doing it every year. But that was a part of the deep work as well.
Yeah, I'm curious a little bit more about how you've learned and what you've learned about the users and, like, maybe, just to give folks some context, like, how many people use your app? I think it's an incredible number.
So we hit the 3 million download mark recently.
That is massive, wow. It's, like, larger than some countries.
Yeah, super cool because when I was launching it, I just didn't even know if like one other person would download it. I didn't launch into it with like a business plan or like with an MBA background. It was more so like, this needs to exist. And I really wish it did because panic attacks don't have to take as long to heal as they did for me.
Yeah, yeah, that's just incredible. Well, I'm curious around kind of the users. When I hear you speak about all this, I just think of, like, someone who's so resourceful and, like, determined, doesn't never gave up, and also, like, doesn't take insufficient advice maybe, like, like the counselors or whoever, your doctor who wasn't very helpful, you know what I mean? It's like, I think of and maybe this is just I'm biased, and I was born in Canada and, with our healthcare system here, but, like, I just get the sense that, like, younger people and I'm in my 30s now, so even our generation is much more sort of resourceful when it comes to sort of maybe that's the internet, but just not listening to your doctor. Necessarily. I shouldn't say, like, not listening to your doctor, but just also making sure you're doing your own research, right? And you strike me as someone who's just, like, gone down that path, like, big time. And I'm curious if you've noticed a difference between sort of the older users of Rooted and folks that are maybe, older than 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe older, having anxiety and panic attacks. Like, when you were speaking about the whole myriad of things to work on, bring your life maybe to another level that maybe less severe anxiety and panic. Do you notice a shift at all between younger and older peoples and their willingness to kind of do all the things versus, like, "Oh, I just gotta follow these steps or listen to my doctor or take this medication," or something like that? And maybe I'm just loading this question too much with my own opinion, but, yeah.
Yeah, not it's hard for me to, like, note the difference. Like, the feedback I get is the user reviews, and then I see some analytics, right?
Mhm.
And that's, like, more anonymized aggregate data. And it's not that there's a big difference in the way folks use the app, but I think a lot of older people will leave a message or a comment and say, "I really wish I had this 10 years ago. I wish I had this 8 years ago," etc. Whereas the younger people, they're just grateful. They're like, "Hey, I love this. Like, this character's so cute. I'm finally going back to school again," or whatnot. So I think, yeah, it's just maybe the time they're finding it in their lives. Like, for people now, they're just Googling it really quick, right? And they find it instantly. And for older folks that have gone through the system and now they're looking for maybe more supporting tools and supplemental tools, they're just like, "Oh, why didn't I have this before?" And yeah, I kind of felt the same when I read about cognitive behavioral therapy for the first time. I'm like, what the heck? Why did nobody tell me about this before? Why did I have to find this in the library?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious if you've, if you felt any on the business side, so I have been running my business for about 5 years now, and I definitely go through waves of motivation. And I think, like, the idea actually came from my partner and her challenge of finding a therapist. And I've always been a big kind of mental health advocate, and I mentioned a little bit about my struggles at university. And but I find that sometimes, like, I'm focusing on a problem that's just I'm trying to keep it focused on finding a therapist, right? And I think that I recently got out of, like, another kind of 2 years of therapy in my life, and now I'm not in therapy, but I'm thinking about the next steps, right, of kind of, like, personal growth and that sort of thing. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, sometimes I have a harder time resonating with my, like, product as, like at first, I was, like, a user and, like, in therapy all the time, and I think I'll be in therapy for the rest of my life, but I'm curious if you've had that experience now that you're saying kind of you're experiencing this panic and you're like such an expert because you obviously built this whole program, right? If you ever have that kind of trouble of maybe like it almost becoming less personal and maybe like your personal goals are kind of moved on from this or like how do you stay motivated? How do you stay with it?
That's a good question. I'd say that I've been beginning to feel parts of what you're describing just because I no longer am experiencing the anxiety and panic attacks. Still go through waves of, just like everybody dealing with stuff. But, I'm now able to travel and do all these things that I wasn't able to do. So that has maybe felt a bit less personal. But I think at the core, this is just recently though, right? Like, so the past, well, a couple of years have been awesome, but now this whole past year has just been so different than the year before that. And so I hear what you're saying, but I do still feel very inspired by it being like my baby, which I know is like kind of lame that entrepreneurs call our startups that, but it does feel like that because everything in Rooted was like, really handcrafted. And I have yet to really get a bunch of outside content. Like, everything in there is really stuff that I'm familiar with. I think if we were to start expanding, then it might feel less. like something that's 100% mine, like the way you're saying. And maybe if we expand to other problem areas that I'm not as familiar with, then that would also contribute to that feeling. But for right now, it's still all the content that I'm like so familiar with. And a big motivator are the user reviews. That's huge. I mentioned that I'm traveling at this last conference I went to. Somebody came up to me in person and was just gushing about the Rooted app, that they couldn't have their job if it wasn't for Rooted because they're required to fly a lot. They have a fear of flying, so they use Rooted. Finally, they're able to get in planes. And she was saying all that stuff before she knew I was the founder. And so that was really sweet to like hear. And every now and then, obviously, majority, 99.9% of the feedback I get is online. But I do meet people that use Rooted in person and they share their stories, or they'll tell me how their dad is using it or their kids are using it. And they just want to say thanks. And I find that like super motivating.
That is awesome.
So when in actually this thing my partner made for me, it's all Rooted user testimonials. It's just obviously a small sample of them, but the idea was to like turn back and just read these when I'm having a crappy day. Just like remember why I'm doing it.
That's such a good
Yeah.
idea. I need to do that too. Yeah, it's when you're I just find when you're working, in the pixel world, in the app or in the website, right? You're just especially when you're working, as a solo founder, single founder without any sort of teammates that are invested as much as you are in it. I just find that, yeah, it's really easy to get removed from why and also like the impact, right? And I think that a lot of folks are okay going through or have different motivations, but I think if you start something because it's solving a problem and you want to like stay connected to that, I think it's a phenomenal idea to have those user testimonials. Tell me a little bit more about starting the company by yourself and growing it initially by yourself and how you've like, what have you learned about community and, maybe just to drag on the question a little bit more, like, I know myself, I've had, like, pretty much 4 different times when I, like, almost had a co-founder and, like, gone down the path, but, like, here I am, still just me. Had you experienced anything similar? Have you been looking or, how do you fill that gap of, yeah, loneliness, I guess?
Yeah, I guess feeling pretty alone while I was growing up. Like it's like almost a constant. And that has maybe in a weird way helped. I've definitely had moments where I've just been up against like a big problem in the business and been pulling my hair out and being like, wow, what do I do? Like, were people right? Like, because when I was starting, everybody said you needed a co-founder. It was almost like non-negotiable. In fact, at the time, people weren't even interested in investing in companies unless they had two co-founders. There was like some sort of trend or something. Maybe it came from the valley, those ideas
Mhm.
of what makes a real company. And I, yeah, came up to those or up against those types of situations quite a few times over the past 5 years, but I'm not sure exactly what is it that makes me like get through it, except now at this time that we're speaking, I'm back to thinking like, yeah, there's absolutely no need for a co-founder at the moment. So yeah, just sort of keep getting through it. But I'd say like the internet is your best friend. Obviously, there's so much awful stuff on the internet, but like it has taught me almost everything I know about business, about apps, about marketing, about B2B growth, all of that. Like literally everything is online. Like you can find it if you look for it.
Mhm. How do you I mean, it sounds like in your upbringing and just, someone and you referenced this before that's put a lot of pressure on themselves. And how does that look today? Like, how do you stay accountable to like your goals or like do you set, hard goals and rigid targets or are you, just kind of like want to continue to grow? How do you like look at your business now and your growth there?
I did for like the first 4 years. And yeah, it was like I needed to do them. Like I would think about it all the time, like before I went to bed. Like it drove me, it motivated me. And now I'm much more chill. I think maybe because I hit those goals. And so now I'm like, oh, like what's next? Like, it's kind of a fun time to be able to take time, like a step back and be like, okay, what are the next goals? But I certainly, thanks to Rooted, thanks to all this progress, like I don't have desperate need for it right now. Whereas I think at first came from like quite a place of desperation, needing to heal, needing to get this message out. needing like quite a few people were like, this isn't going to work. Maybe I had a chip on my shoulder about that. I needed to, show them that it would, that type of thing. Like, I don't have that right now currently. I'm feeling quite content with where Rooted at and what it's achieved. There's always more growth to be had. Obviously, 3 million is just scratching the surface. Even though it's so many, it's still just scratching the surface. But I guess because I'm not venture backed as well, I don't have that external pressure on anything. And yeah, I just really want to get this out to people who can benefit from it the most, which may sound corny, but like there's just like, that's the underlying core of Rooted. And so now working with larger organizations, that's like been really cool and really like values aligned. And it's just made me feel like the early days of Rooted again, where it's just all about getting it out to people, making sure the content's awesome and making sure people are enjoying it versus worrying about growth at a specific number.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, it sounds incredible, like almost like a gift just to be able to feel that contentness, right? I mean, it sounds like the beginning of this story stemmed from not being able to sit with any sort of contentness, right? So now you've
Yeah,
kind of achieved that, and that's
totally.
incredible. To wrap things up, I heard you say, I think, the word heal a few times. And I know for me personally, that word has grown on me a lot since I kind of entered into this mental health space. And at first I was like, well, heal, like what's, like that sounds like there's got to be something wrong in order to heal. So that's kind of like that's a bigger that's a bigger step to even like accept that. I'm curious what that word means to you, heal, and your use of it over that. Has that changed?
Yeah, it's a good question. Probably. I haven't sat down to think about the word in particular, but I guess you're right. Healing implies at first a self awareness that not everything's okay. And then for me, healing has largely been about reversing the cycle that we talked about, reversing that cycle of fear and even starting like more of a cycle of like chill. And that has been a big part of healing. I lost my mom at a young age. And so that is still like feels like open wound at times. And that a lot of people say that grief comes in waves. I'd say that's probably quite accurate for me. And the goal is like for that to always look and feel a bit different when the waves come crashing again. And it's not like a goal that I like it's more like a calming goal, that's something that I talk about with a therapist versus set as a goal. So maybe I didn't use that word correctly, but
Mhm.
yeah, that is a part of healing, a part of being able to find contentness. And, I mentioned that I'm pretty chill about my goals with Rooted right now, but like people around me are like, I like this. You gotta like take it off now, or like, do set this 10 times higher, set the bar 10 times higher. So I think healing is also being a part of it is just listening to my own goals and inner voice versus like feeling peer pressure from those around me. All of those are part of healing. So I don't know if I answered that question correctly, but
I think that's like so much wisdom in that response. So, and after now knowing some of the folks that I can picture, giving you giving you some of that encouragement or kind of pressure, yeah, like that is hard to still trust yourself and to listen to yourself. And yeah, thanks for sharing that part about the grief. I think, yeah, that's really deep and special. So, this conversation has been really, really nice. So, thank you for sharing your story and your passion. And yeah, how do you spell rooted and where can people get it?
so you spell Rooted Roodd. So no E. And you can get it on the app stores, both on Apple and Google Play. And yeah, you can also find us online on social, on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it. We're there.
Amazing. We're gonna link all that too in the notes here. So, Anya, thank you so much, and I hope to see you around soon.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, take care. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Actualize podcast. You can find the show notes for this episode, as well as all other episodes, at firstsession.com/podcast. If you like this podcast, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.